as well. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. Give me 1 second. And okay, we got that going. I'm going to double check that our YouTube streaming is starting. I think we're good. Okay, everybody. Well, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. This is a fun session I'm really looking forward to. I got my good friend, uh, good buddy Caleb on here with us tonight. He's going to be our other guest presenter for the evening. I'm going to ask that everybody just kind of keep their mics muted for the night. Yeah, and Caleb and I will be chatting. So our game plan for the night is we're going to be approximately an hour. We'll do our best. Those of you that have done sessions with Caleb and I in the past, you know that we do have a tendency of going over. We're both very passionate about what we do and very passionate about what we talk about. So often when we get sharing, you know, it's hard to stop or hard not to go off on tangents. But we're going to do our best to be about an hour tonight. I'm going to kick us off for the first half an hour or so, and with some teachings and some sharings, and then I'm going to pass it over to Caleb for the second half, and then we're going to do a little bit of question and answer at the end. So that's kind of our game plan. And for those that are just tuning in, maybe just jump in the chat really quick and say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. It'd be nice to hear from you. If you're watching this live on YouTube, do the same. I won't be checking the YouTube chat for those of you that are watching on YouTube, but I do always go in and look at it afterwards. And I'm always, I always love seeing the comments in YouTube as well. So if you're on YouTube tonight, feel free to throw some comments in there as well. We just might not get to them until afterwards. So to start us off tonight, I'll just share, I'm really excited about tonight. I've actually had a great week out on the land. I spent a couple of days over in Parry Sound this week with Parry Sound Forest School. They hired me to come and do some training for their staff, which is always a ton of fun, working with young adults to help deepen kids' relationship with the land, which is very much related to what we're talking about tonight, kind of human potential as it relates to the land. And I went from Parry Sound all the way up to North Bay. And I don't know how many people here. Has anyone on the crowd ever slept on a lake before? Like on a frozen lake in the wintertime? But not last night, but the night before, I actually slept out on the middle of Lake Nipissing. We were on about 11 inches of ice out on an ice hut. We were the only people out in the middle of the lake at night. I mean, there were other people out there, but the only people around us. And man, there's a magic and a beauty to being out on a lake in the middle of the night. We were out there fishing for a couple of days, had a great time, caught some nice pickerel. Came back to run this evening with Caleb tonight. And then in another day, I head up to Temagami for a week, and I'll be spending some time on the land up there. And I share all of this to kick us off, just to, share some gratitude for how fortunate I feel to live in a part of the world where we have such an abundance of amazing habitat to go and explore and to support us. I know not all places in the world, have the luxury of being able to, spend time on clean water or fish out of lakes that still have native fish stocks in them. And I just feel a lot of gratitude for those things this morning as we kick us off. So I kind of mentioned our plan for the night already. Caleb's on here already. You'll get to hear his voice shortly here. And yeah, we're going to be about an hour tonight is kind of our game stand. So I'm going to kick us off with kind of the first teaching part of the night tonight. So tonight's theme is called Learning the Land. And, I do a lot of different things. For those of you that have been kind of following me along for a while and kind of know my journey, I'm into a lot of things, for as far as interests go, but I also teach about a lot of things. My wife and I have the homestead, we have the Wild Muskoka, the foraging business, herbal medicine, I'm into martial arts. I teach a hunting course and I'm really into hunting and fishing, growing food and the farm, bushcraft and survival, which is of course what brought Caleb and I together originally and helped us connect. But out of all of these different things, there's one thread. There's a few threads, but there's one main thread for me that runs through all of them. And I see it as the foundation of everything else I do in all of these other skill sets. And that really is kind of what we're talking about, this idea, the idea that all of those things are supported by habitat and supported by ecology. And having that as a foundation to everything else I do, I find it kind of leverages everything, back in my days when I first started getting into this stuff, I used to go down to the tracker school and train with Tom Brown Jr., a guy that's pretty famous down in the States. There's definitely some controversy around Tom, and I'll definitely, admit to that. But he's also had a big influence on a lot of people, and he did influence me. But something that I learned really quickly hanging out with Tom down in the tracker school, so he's teaching these like hardcore survival courses down there. But if you don't have a really strong foundation in naturalist skills and you don't know your plants and you don't know your trees and you don't know your insects, you're really only going to go so far with the survival skills. But as your relationship with the land grows and your knowledge of all those different other parts of the ecosystem, and not just the parts on their own, but actually understanding their relationships within each other, and the relationships between the fungi and the trees and the water, and you put that all together and it becomes an ecosystem or habitat. If you don't really have a really good grasp of habitat and relationship to the relationships that make up habitat, you're really only going to go so far with survival skills. And I think the same thing applies to, growing food and gardening and permaculture, self-reliance, all these different things that I'm into. And I've thought a lot about that foundational skill set and just how important it's been to the human species throughout history, this deep relationship with the land and this deep knowing of place, this deep knowing of the habitat that we live in. So that's kind of going to be our theme for the call tonight, because it really relates to all of these other pieces. And, Caleb, he's, internationally known as a bushcraft guy, but he's a phenomenal naturalist, first. And I bet you he wouldn't be the bushcraft guy he is today if he wasn't brought up with that foundational teaching around the naturalist skills and those ecology pieces. So I'm excited tonight to kind of share a teaching. When I think about relationship to the land and natural awareness, one of the teachings that's probably been the most influential for me in that is kind of what I want to speak to and share tonight. And I'm hoping that I'm going to present it in a way that it's maybe very eye-opening for some of you. And it's presented in a way where it's actually going to give you something practical to go out and work on from here, that maybe actually you notice the impact on you and your relationship with the land, with it, and your natural awareness. So that's what I'm excited to dive into tonight. And I'm going to kick that off with a little bit of a story, actually a couple stories to kick it off. The first one is actually a story about watching a YouTube video. So this was probably like 8-9 years ago. And I'm watching this YouTube video. I don't know how I ended up watching this YouTube video, but somehow it popped up and I'm watching this guy. He's some famous YouTuber. He's got hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of followers. I'm pretty sure this is a young kid, makes a full-time living. And he's down in Florida, and it's right before a hurricane's about to hit. And of course, he knows the hurricane is coming. Everybody's battening down. There's evacuation orders, all this stuff going on. And he's got his little YouTube cam, and he's sitting out on the side of the ocean. And he's like, look at this, man. It's such a peaceful day right now. And he's looking around. He's like, it's sunny outside. It looks beautiful. There's no wind. He's like, it's crazy to think that there's a hurricane that's on his way here. And he makes this comment that's, quite arrogant, or maybe arrogant's not the right word. Ignorant is probably the more appropriate word. And basically he says, I feel sorry for the indigenous peoples of this land, like 300 years ago, because they would have had no idea this was coming. And like, I literally laughed out loud when he made this comment, to think that, people need to rely on a weather app to know something as serious as a hurricane is coming. It made me laugh out loud, because even watching the video through the YouTube, there were so many signs that you could even pick up through the video if you had some baseline naturalist knowledge that things were actually about to change or about to shift. So it's kind of interesting to think about this guy, a massive influencer in the world, speaking to hundreds of thousands of people, completely unaware that there's signs of nature. In nature, that the weather's about to shift. It had just been totally lost on this guy, as it was for many people. And I had this moment of being like, oh man, that's so ignorant, or what an arrogant comment. But then I actually reflected for a second about my own journey, and I thought, you know what, 15 years ago I might have said something really similar to what he just said there. Now I wouldn't have said it in front of hundreds of thousands of people, so I might not have had the same negative ripple impact as he did. But the whole point there being is I thought back about my journey, because I spent my whole childhood outdoors, a ton of time. I went camping, I was in Boy Scouts, I did canoe guiding, but I wasn't brought up in a culture that really had depth of relationship with the land and depth of understanding of ecology and habitat and place and the web of life and how they interweave. The culture that I was brought in, we went into the outdoors kind of more like tourists. We went into the outdoors because it was fun. It was healthy for us. We enjoyed it. It was pretty. Sure, we would notice some birds and pay attention to a few things. But I was actually pretty oblivious to something like the idea that the nature is telling me the weather's changing most of my life, up until I was in my 20s, completely oblivious. And I had a really humbling moment or a few of them in my early 20s when I started meeting some of my first mentors that started opening me up to how much is around me and in front of me, and I don't know anything about. And it's right there, and it's been in front of me my whole life. And I was just completely oblivious because I wasn't in a culture that recognized those things anymore. I always think, if any of you guys know the call of a robin, I hope a good chunk of folks here tonight know what a robin sounds like. But I remember, so this was one of my humbling moments. I was in this class and somebody played a robin call on a phone. I'm 20 years old. I've done canoe tripping, Boy Scouts, all these things. And they were basically like, hey, I'm going to play a few bird calls. Do you recognize whose they are? And they played a robin call and I got it wrong. I didn't know what a robin sounded like. And I had this like humbling moment because I was like, wow, like robins have literally been singing in front of me since probably the day I was born, or within a few days of my born. I've heard robin calls. And yet here I am, 20 years old, somebody that canoe trips, even is guiding canoe trips, and I don't actually associate the call to that actual bird. How is that even possible? And it's kind of funny. So that the mnemonic device that I kind of use now to remember the robin's call, if you kind of think about the cadence of it, to me it sounds like you're saying, here I am, where are you? Here I am, where are you? So the joke I've kind of come up with is the robin is basically taunting me. He's like, hey, here I am, Chris, where are you? I've been singing in front of you my whole life. You don't even know my name, or you don't even know my song. I'm right here, Chris. Where are you? Here I am. Where are you? So that's kind of become my funny little way of remembering the robin call in that humbling moment. So I'm sharing this story for a reason, and there's a bit of a trajectory for where I want to kind of go with this call tonight, and it starts to set up the teaching. Before I do the specific of the teaching, though, I'm going to jump forward a good number of years, probably about 10, 15 years to another story. So now I've been diving deep into these kind of ancient ways of relating to the land and studying tracking and birds and ecology and all these different things. And I'm running a workshop. It's down on the edge of Toronto in the GTA, but we're out in this beautiful forest area. And I do have to admit, I knew there was a storm coming. I checked the weather on my phone before I went out that morning, and there's a pretty significant storm coming. But I'm always thinking about the weather and how it impacts the activity of animals around me. So we show up that morning, and things seem pretty normal. There's a lot of bird activity going around, and we're doing basically carving skills and fire skills. So I paused the group first thing in the morning, and I'm like, hey, I just want everybody to pay attention to the birds right now. Just everyone pause 5 minutes and just sit where you are and listen. And I had the whole group listen and said, okay, cool, let's go back to work. So a little bit of time goes by. It's a beautiful sunny day. The weather is really beautiful. There's very little breeze. Everything kind of just seems normal. And then what I basically notice, it comes around, it's about 10 o'clock in the morning now, and the birds are usually still, so this is in the springtime, usually 10 o'clock in the morning in the springtime, you're still kind of at the later end of the morning chorus, like the birds kind of doing their songs and they're about to shift into nesting behavior and kind of feeding behavior. But there's like this frantic energy to the birds this morning. They're moving around faster. There's more alarm calls. So these like kind of sharper, higher chip calls. And I really pick up on, like, from when I first mentioned it to the group, when we first got there at 9, we basically do this. Now it's an hour later, and there's actually a bit of a change to kind of the cadence, even just the feel of the birds. So I say to the group, I'm like, hey guys, we're just going to pause a second. I just want you guys all to tune in again. And the group tunes in. I'm like, notice anything different? And most of them actually didn't notice any different from the morning till there. Which makes sense, because these aren't people that had spent a lot of time, studying birds. But I was able to notice a difference there. So another hour goes by. It's now 11 a.m. and there is no bird activity at all. It's dead silent, which again, this doesn't make sense. It's a beautiful sunny day. There's no wind and the birds are dead quiet right now. So I share with the group, I'm like, hey crew, I want you to listen again for a second right now. And it's funny because nobody else in the group had actually noticed that the birds had stopped singing because they were just so absorbed in their project and what they're doing. So the first thing I just said, has anyone noticed any changes in the birds? And everyone was like, no, I don't think so. I'm like, okay, quiet. Let's listen right now. So the group all listens for a couple of moments. We pull back in. I'm like, okay, what are you guys picking up on? They're like, it's so quiet compared to when we did this an hour ago. What's going on? I'm like, I don't know. I just wanted you to listen for a second. Let's go back to work. So we go back to work. About 20 minutes later, trees are literally bending over sideways with wind. And it looks like Mordor, like the dark clouds rolling in. And what's amazing is, that whole story was being sung about by the birds all morning long. And it's kind of fun because, jumping forward a number of years, there's no way I would have noticed that in my 20s. By the time I'm in my 30s, I'm starting to think about that stuff all the time, and it becomes this really powerful tool set for awareness. I can actually think about the very first time that I learned about bird language, or sorry, the very first time that I think I consciously experienced it, but I didn't know what was going on. I remember being in college, and I'm in my 20s. I'm at the very start of kind of this deeper naturalist journey, when going from the superficial tourist kind of outdoors experience to like, oh wow, there's actually a lot more to this than what I realized. So I'm at the very start of that. I've had a couple humbling moments. I've had a couple mentors come into my life, and I'm sitting in this forest, and I'm noticing. So at that point, I had been getting into birds a little bit, and something that I noticed that cardinals usually sing from the top of the trees, or at very least like the top third of a tree. But often they're like right at the very top when they're singing. So same kind of thing. It's actually spring again. It's May time, and I'm sitting in the forest, and I actually notice like, oh, all of the cardinals are actually down in the lower part of the canopy. Like they're almost at level with me, and they're scurrying around really quick, and they're not making a lot of noise. And I just kind of noticed that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, the robin. What's going on with the cardinals? Didn't think too much of it, other than it was just a little different than what I've been observing. Similar kind of thing, a little bit of time goes by, and all of a sudden I realize like it's eerily quiet. It's like, geez, it's the middle of the day. Like there's no noise from the birds, but it's like beautiful, it's sunny, and it's dead quiet. I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to have a little nap. And I close my eyes, and I basically wake up a half an hour later, and it's snowing, and it's May. So we get hit by this wall of snow in May. So basically, I get hit with the snow and don't think much of it. It's like, okay, I'm heading home. Go home. Really didn't think much about it. A few years later, I'm basically sitting in a class, receiving a teaching similar to what I'm going to do tonight. And I basically had this light bulb moment go off where I'm like, oh my goodness, that day back in Lindsay when I was sitting in the forest, this is what was happening there. Those cardinals, their reason they weren't up in the canopies and they were down lower, it was actually nesting season. The cardinals already knew the weather was going to change, and they're basically hunkering down and preparing for the storm to come in, doing all their little last minute tasks in the understory instead of being up at the top of the tree. And then just before the storm, they've gone quiet. They're all hunkered in. That was my indicator that they were actually telling me, not necessarily telling me, but as somebody that listens to that information was out there in the forest, that weather shift was about to happen. I was totally oblivious. And even after going through it, because I didn't have mentors to help point it out, I didn't even realize that until like 3 years later when someone was explaining this on a whiteboard. And I was just like, oh my goodness, that's what was going on. And it was a huge light bulb moment for me. Like it was a really big shift. It makes me really think about this saying that I really like. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, but it's the idea that we don't know what we don't know. And I think for the first, 20 years of my life, I really didn't know what I didn't know. And I was oblivious to the level of depth of human potential when it comes to being able to read the story of the natural world, interact with the story of the natural world, and be a part of that story in a conscious way. Like up until that point, it was like you go out into nature and you go on an adventure and it's really pretty and you hear some birds. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's all beautiful and wonderful. But I was just completely oblivious how deep that rabbit hole actually goes. And now as someone that's actually kind of studied survival and studied the way that various cultures around the world have lived off the land, kind of pre-industrial revolution, and I think about the skill set. Like, I mean, how often do you actually do that, folks? Like, how often have you sat and really thought about, like, imagine right now the house you're in, all the fancy whatever drywall, metal, like steel, like it's all gone. You don't have a car in your driveway. There's no grocery store to go get your food. There's no pharmacy. Like everything supporting us is coming from the land and our people's relationship with the land. And that's not to say that we don't necessarily have some advanced tools. Maybe we're working with steel. Maybe we're working with rock. We're definitely in a shelter, potentially a very efficient and effective shelter. But just that thought that, like, there is no light switch in the evening. There is no oven. There is no, flowing water unless you've designed a system out of natural materials to make it flow for some reason. To think that humans lived like that for such a long period of human history, and then in a blink of an eye, we're so reliant on all of this advanced technology. It makes me really just think like, wow, yeah, humans to be able to live in that kind of habitat, year round, 365 days a year, no matter what the weather was, and to get their food and to stay safe, yeah, you would have to have like what would almost feel like a superhuman skill set to most modern humans today, or at least it feels like that to me, you know? So that in my early 20s, that thought right there when I first had it, like that blew my mind and inspired me so much and set me off on a lifelong journey that I'm still on today. I still think there's a ton that I don't know today. I know that the difference is now I know I don't know what I don't know. Back then, I didn't know that I don't know what I don't know. And I think today I'm recognized in the outdoors and people come and I do these workshops and these programs. But I wasn't brought up like this the first 20 years of my life. So I feel very behind as far as what's even what even potential can be reached. But I've seen enough to know that the rabbit hole is so deep and it's so inspiring and it's so empowering when we start to kind of reconnect with these things. I'm going to be passing it over to Caleb kind of shortly here. But I've learned, and I meant to say this during the open tonight. I'll let Caleb kind of introduce himself in a few minutes here. But Caleb, he's become a really good friend of mine. But I also actually look up to Caleb as a mentor as well. He's an absolute wealth of knowledge. He had a very different upbringing than myself. And I've learned so much from him over the years, kind of as it relates to this bigger story around relationship to the land and human potential on the land. So I just want to kind of give a shout out to Caleb and say thank you, Caleb, for everything that you've actually taught me over the years, as it kind of relates to what I'm going into tonight. So I'm going to share a slide right now, and I want to share a little teaching right now that's been really helpful for me, and how this is teaching can actually be applied to many different disciplines in life and many different activities, even in the context of our modern world. So give me a half second here. I'm going to bring my screen up. This is actually part of a slideshow that I do for a class that I run called Reading Nature's Language. So I'm going to just show you, this is our virtual campfire number 6. We have these calls that we get together. We call them the virtual campfires, where we meet around the virtual fire here on Zoom and kind of dive deep into these teachings. So the teaching I want to share tonight is this idea of baseline. And even if you've heard me speak to this before, hopefully I'm going to add some kind of new layers to it. The more I understand this, the more profound it actually is, and the more influence it has on my understanding of how the world works, and the more I'm actually able to use it in different scenarios and situations. Like it's really a powerful teaching. I was exposed to it 15 years ago, and I feel like I'm still just like peeling back layers of the onion. And on some ways it's so simple, and on other ways it's so deep. So when I use the term baseline, what I'm really referring to here, on a real simple level is just like, what is the normal activity level? And I'm going to give it to you an example right now as it relates to birds and bird activity. But and then I'm going to give you an example as it relates to tracking and being able to read the story written in the wildlife footprints on the ground. So I put a little graph here. On the left here, we have something called activity level. So, the higher up you go, the more activity you have. And on the bottom there, we have the time of day. And, I just kind of made this really quick for the class, but this baseline is going to change a little bit throughout the seasons, throughout the time of year. There's a few variables that will kind of impact this. But this is the baseline activity of the birds and the sound in the forest is what we're talking about here. So let's imagine this is kind of, just looking at the times here. Yeah, let's say this is like August right now, roughly. So if you look over on the left here, 3 a.m. in the forest in August, the birds are even in an urban park for that matter, the birds aren't really making a lot of noise, You might hear the odd little blip, if there's raccoons moving around and feeding and they spook a bird up and, you'll hear little chips in the middle of the night. But generally the forest is pretty quiet at the night, unless you're an owl or certain species, right? So our baseline for nighttime is actually really quiet, the odd chip here or there, and maybe a couple of owls that are hooting, and some footprints of raccoons walking around. The frogs are maybe singing. That's our baseline. That's what's normal. Just before the sun starts to come up, we start to see the activity level rise a little bit. We might hear the raccoons are now like they're heading back to go to bed for the daytime. They might try and raid a couple nests on their way in or do a little bit of hunting. And you get a couple chirps here and there. You always have those couple of birds that'll start singing like a little bit before the sun comes up. Where I am, it's the phoebe that wakes me up every morning. In the springtime, I don't know who else has phoebes, but the phoebe Phoebe. And they do it so loud. Phoebe, Phoebe. But I have one no fail every year that sings right outside my bedroom window at like 5:30 in the morning. Like it's not even first light yet, and the Phoebe's already singing this call. So there's every area has its like first one or two birds. And there's a fun, just little naturalist question for you tonight. You know, what bird is the first bird to start singing in your region? This is a kind of fun one to think about in the springtime. So, anyways, you get this first little blast of activity, and then what happens is, you know, once the sun comes up, you get this explosion of activity on the landscape. We call it the morning chorus, where all the birds are kind of singing their songs. You know, you get territorial aggression happening, you get feeding song. And the first couple hours in the morning, there's this really high level of bird activity. After the morning chorus and those morning songs, though, the activity starts to slowly drop off, right? And there's still lots of bird activity. If you think back to that story that I told you with my group, so we show up at the spot at 9 in the morning. I ask the group to listen, and the birds are all singing, and it's like, yeah, just sounds normal. An hour later, I asked them to tune in. They're like, oh yeah, birds are still there. It's not quite as loud, but yeah, we can still hear them around there. Now, usually in the summertime, especially when it's hot, by like midday, you know, the birds have been feeding all morning. They've been fighting, they've been drinking, they've been building nests, doing whatever they're doing. And the activity kind of plateaus. Now, not plateaus like the middle of the night. There's still activity, but they're just kind of like, it's a lot quieter. You know, some of them are resting, some of them are moving around. Very few of them are singing. You hear the odd chip here and there. And it's actually kind of this afternoon lull in the forest. And then right before the sun starts to go down, you usually get a second wave of activity. Birds, you know, do that last little bit of feeding, do those last couple of chores before it gets dark. And then you usually get some birds that sing at dusk, right? So we get this second chorus at dusk, but it's not nearly as active or loud as the morning chorus, right? That evening chorus is significantly quieter than the morning chorus, at least in most of the habitats I hang out in. And then, of course, the sun goes down, and then that activity level just plummets and drops right off. So this is the idea of baseline right here. I'm going to chat about how to apply this to some interesting scenarios in just a second here. But I want to make sure everybody's kind of following me. And I'm going to just draw a couple of things on here. So give me a second. Yeah, that'll work here. Is that working? Great. So imagine it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're sitting out in the woods, or maybe, you know, you got your window open and all of a sudden you hear a bunch of bird activity at 3 o'clock in the morning. We would call this right here a break in baseline. That's not normal. It's telling me that something is going on, right? The story I told you a minute ago about the weather, when I was out with that group, or the extreme example of the YouTuber and the hurricane. So it's 11 a.m., right? 11 a.m., the activity is supposed to be pretty high up here. That day when I was with my group, it actually went from morning chorus to like this, like basically plummeted to nighttime activity. So me, if I know what the baseline is, like usually at 11 a.m. in August, there's a ton of bird activity. And then all of a sudden it's 11 a.m. in August and it's dead quiet. That's not random. That's actually telling me something. That's a usable piece of information, right? It may be related to the weather. It might be related to predators. You know, this is a super fun one, but you know, birds can tell you when people are moving around the landscape, when cougars are moving around the landscape, or predators. You know, if you have a chorus going off and all of a sudden it goes silent in one spot, but then there's still noise, you know, in the distance all around it, it could be that something is creating a disturbance. You know, maybe there's a cougar that's hunting. Maybe there's a group that's walking through the forest. I've had tons of fun. You know, we often go out with friends. I used to do a lot more than I do now, but we go and play these like kind of like capture the flag games and these awareness games out in the woods. And often you can actually tell where the other groups are by listening to where the lull was in the birds. And the people that didn't know this are suddenly at a serious strategic disadvantage to the people that do. Because you're actually like, oh, even though I can't see the people and I can't hear them, like I can hear bird song everywhere except over there. Like I'm going to guess that's where they are. And you'd be surprised how often with a bit of practice, you might actually be right. I've had a number of times, you know, we had a fun one with a group one year. I wonder if, somebody's got their mic on there. Hey, if you got your mic on now, please mute yourself. Caleb, maybe you can take a quick look through and see if you can shut that off or mute whoever's got their mic on. Okay, anyway, sorry, back to that story there. Just kind of a fun one here is, so I wonder if anyone recognizes this. I'm not good at whistling and doing bird calls, but there's, if you can know who this is, throw it in the chat from my and I'll be impressed because it's not going to be the best impression. But there's a bird that sounds kind of like this. It's called, it goes dee 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 dee. Dee 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 dee. Anyone heard that before? Throw it in the chat if you even think you've heard that before. Dee 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 dee. Dee 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 dee. So I'm out in the forest, and we're actually getting ready to run a 2-day survival program for a group. And I know at some point the group is coming in with the other guide. I have no idea what time they're supposed to be showing up. And all morning long, we're listening to this group off, or these birds off in the distance. It's actually a white-throated sparrow, if you're wondering. So all morning long, the white-throated sparrows are singing that. That's their song. And it's kind of fun. I'm out there with my wife, Laura, and all of a sudden, they switch from dee 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 to dee 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 dee. And we get this alarm call. And Laura and I look at each other like, oh, sweet, the group's coming. So we basically go down the trail and we hide right on the edge of the trail. And it's literally 5 minutes before the group comes up. 5 minutes before we could hear or see them, the white-throated sparrows told us they were coming up the trail. Can you think about how much that changes your experience in the forest? If suddenly you're able to tune into the birds and they're telling you about what's way beyond what you can see or even hear yourself going on. And they're maybe telling you about weather that's 24 hours out. And it's not just the birds that are doing this. The insects are giving us information. The other animals are giving us information. The trees are giving us information. This whole art I like to refer to as reading nature's language, you know? So I'm going to stop my share here for a second. Oh, actually, no, sorry. I'm going to give you one more example here before I stop my share. I need to figure out how to clear this. They've gone and changed all the settings here on Miss. Oh, there we go. Clear all drawings. Perfect. Okay, so there's an example of baseline with bird activity. But this same concept of baseline can be applied to so many different areas. And I want to give you a quick example with tracking. So one of my biggest passions, another one of my biggest passions is wildlife tracking. And to me, wildlife tracking, you know, when I first was introduced to it, wildlife tracking for me was like you go into the forest and you find a lifeless depression on the ground and you figure out who it is. And it's like, okay, that was a fox. That was a wolf. That was a bear. Sweet, that's tracking. Now I realize that that just barely tips the iceberg of what tracking is. Trackers are storytellers. They're reading the story of the past and the present, and they're actually able to make predictions about the future based on that information. Trackers look at the landscape like a storybook, and the footprints, the trees, the branch patterns, the weather, all of those are the actual alphabet. Those are the language that you're piecing together into this bigger story of what happened, what's happening right now, and what do I think might happen in the future. That's what tracking actually is about to me. And the way that what started to shift tracking for me from like, you know, looking at just identifying footprints and putting a name on it, which really doesn't mean anything. Like this 4 printed thing, this is a cougar. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, I don't know anything about a cougar, just call a track a cougar. Where I start to really know a lot about the cougar is when I start to understand the patterns that it makes on the landscape and how different patterns might actually tell me what it's doing or even what it's thinking or where it might be right now. So here's a couple of really quick patterns, and I'm not going to do an in-depth teaching on this tonight. I just want to share the concept. But, you know, on the left here, we've got this kind of cool little zigzag pattern that you can see, right? This next one down the middle here, you've got like these 2 tracks side by side, but one's kind of bigger and one's smaller. And then each track, they alternate which side the bigger one's on. So that's a pattern, right? The third one over there, you'll notice there's a track at the bottom. There's 2 tracks side by side, and then there's a track at the top. And if there was actually a space in between those, that pattern repeats itself. So it's always like this 1 foot, 2 foot, 1 foot space, 1 foot, 2 foot, 1 foot space, 1 foot, 2 foot, 1 foot space. That's a pattern, right? The one on the right there is a pattern. So all animals have a pattern to the way that they usually move, just like the forest has a pattern to the way that it usually sounds. And as a tracker, once you understand how an animal usually moves through the landscape, if you notice something unusual, you now know there's a story to be told. And those stories can have an incredible amount of depth to them. So I'm going to give you one really quick example here. And just to give you a cue, Caleb, I'm going to pass it over to you in about 5 minutes. So if you want to be ready to go in about 5. So this pattern, actually, if I scroll down here, I'm going to see if I can give a bit or, yeah, let's look at this one right here to start. So this pattern here is what we call a diagonal walk pattern. And I might actually spread these out just a little bit. Something like this. And the diagonal walk pattern is the baseline pattern. See down there, I said the baseline of our ungulates. So ungulates are like our deer, our moose, like most of our hooved animals. It's also the baseline of cats, of dogs, and of humans. So what happens is their back foot actually lands on top of their front foot when they walk. Like the foot doesn't land on top of it. The back track gets superimposed over top of the front track. And it creates this diagonal pattern where each print has a front and a back foot in it. That's very different than, say, a raccoon. A raccoon's baseline is this one here, where you actually have the back and front landing side by side, not on top of each other. And each step, it actually rotates, which is on which side, right? So this pattern here is how a raccoon usually moves. This one here is how like a deer, a fox, a lynx, a mountain lion usually move in this diagonal pattern. So I mentioned that Parry Sound Forest School hired me last week to come and do a couple of days of training with their staff. So we're out in the field there, and we come across a pattern. I'm going to go back to the annotate here for a second. That basically looks like this set of tracks on the left here. So this is the diagonal walk of a deer, right? And if you continue it down this way, it's similar, but a little bit different. So this group had done almost no tracking before. So I brought them over here and just to take a quick look at it and said, hey, group, take a look at this here. And, you know, what do you see? And most folks right away are like, oh, yeah, cool, it's a deer. You know, what do we know? Anything else? And people didn't really have too much more info than, you know, this is a deer. Cool. So what was really interesting, I'm going to draw the line here, but right just before where that blue track on its own was, this was actually a hill. So this side here was actually a pretty steep hill. So the deer is walking in this diagonal walk pattern up the hill. This is the normal way that a deer walks, diagonal walk pattern. And if you weren't a tracker, you might not have noticed this one little subtle difference. There's one front foot that's just a little bit off to the left here. It's not in it. See how this set of tracks has a nice straight line? There's one track that's just slightly out of place, and it's not a back foot on top of a front foot. It's just a single front foot. So I kind of pointed that out to the group. I'm like, hey, what's going on? See this pattern here? And they actually, I think, I'm trying to remember, I don't think they noticed that print at first. You know, it wasn't as obvious as what I'm showing here. But we kind of looked at that part, and then I said, hey, anything changed here? And the group noticed, oh, well, these prints here, they're actually further apart than these prints there. What's that all about? And I thought, oh, yeah, well, maybe it's speeding up. I'm like, yeah, it is. So here we have on the left an animal that's walking. Here on the right, we have an animal that's jogging. What's going on right in the middle here? And they actually noticed after I kind of pointed out, oh, yeah, okay, there's one track that's slightly off center from this line, and it doesn't have a second track in it. What's going on there? So let's go back. And so I actually literally got down like a deer and I walked in them. And you can imagine I'm going up the hill. I get to the top of the ridge and I step off to the left. I turn my head and I look. I look around and I decide, okay, I'm going out into the open. I want to move a little bit faster. And I actually pick up my speed just a little bit. So then I go back into this diagonal cadence again, but the length between them is a little bit faster. And then it actually switched to this pattern we see on the bottom here, where you've got two front feet, two back feet that have gone past it, and then a giant space in between. Two front feet, two back feet that have gone past it, another giant space. So now it's in a full-on run, right? And all I really wanted to exemplify right now is, you know, to a tracker, this is actually a story. And once you learn these basic patterns, you can actually, with a pretty quick glance, read that story like a book. And it not only does it tell me that the deer was walking, it tells me that it stopped and it looked over its left shoulder and then it chose to speed up and then it went to a run. In a glance, we have that information. You know, we can sometimes tell that an animal is aggressive. Like we might even know the emotional state the animal was in when it put that footprint on the ground. It's so deep where this actually goes. And you know, once you start to learn this, if you haven't dove into the gates yet, it completely transforms what a walk through the forest is. There's just so much more there than just these lifeless depressions on the ground. And I thought identifying lifeless depressions was cool. But when I was opened up to this, again, it was just like mind-blowing how deep this rabbit hole actually goes. So I'm going to stop my share here. And, you know, the last thing I just want to share about this before I pass it over to Caleb to do the second half of the evening is that this concept of baseline can be applied to so much more, so many more things in a really practical way, right? So we talked about how the bird language activity has a baseline. I just shared about how tracks have a baseline. Well, weather has a baseline, right? It's kind of interesting. I think about some of the debates happening. I absolutely, I don't understand how someone could argue that the climate isn't changing. And in the same breath, I'll say, I think the climate's always been changing, and it's had periods of time where that sped up and periods of times where it slowed down. Where I'm going with this, it's interesting to hear people talk about climate change on either side of the spectrum when they don't have a strong naturalist knowledge and a strong foundation of ecology. Because if you don't know the baseline of the weather in the first place, then every time there's a tornado or a significant event, it's like, oh my goodness, it's climate change. But when we look at the baseline over a long period of time, it's like, oh no, we had tornadoes a long time ago. We had these extreme events. Now, the flip side of that is like people will be like, oh, well, it always gets cold in the winter. We always have forest fires. And it's like, well, no, that's out of line with the baseline as well. Tracking climate change is like knowing the baseline of weather over like 100 years or hundreds of years and noticing the anomalies within that baseline. But if you're only thinking about it over like a human's lifetime, it's really easy to actually have a warped perspective on whether something's in baseline or not, because you just don't actually have enough data points, right? One of the huge ones I think about, people that live close to the land, naturalists, I think many different indigenous peoples around the world, even farmers for that matter, a lot of them were talking about noticing that climate was changing long before science was talking about it and politicians were talking about it. Like 40 years ago, people were talking about it. People that spent time on the land, and they're noticing subtle patterns in the insects, patterns in the birds. And if you don't know, here's an interesting question. From a stewardship perspective, if we don't actually know, the insects are often some of the most sensitive creatures that we have. Things like bees on the landscape, super important ecological role, very sensitive to environmental change. Amphibians are another group like that. Things like salamanders, certain species of frogs, incredibly sensitive to like a couple degree change in the water temperature, right? I think, if we did a quiz today, and again, I would have been guilty of this 20 years ago. If we did a quiz today on like, name the bulk of amphibians that live within, 10 miles of your home, the majority of people, I would bet, like don't know 80%, maybe even 90% of the amphibians that live around them. Probably even more insects. And I'll admit, like, I'm still pretty bad with my insects. That's definitely a weak spot in my ecological game. Knowing that those are ecological indicators for big change on the landscape, how do we know that we're living in ecological balance and that we're living as good stewards if we're not actually even able to know the baseline of the creatures that would tell us that something's changing, right? For most of human history, we needed to have that kind of information. It was part of our survival. And I would argue it's just as relevant today to our survival as it ever was. But somehow we've kind of forgotten how important those indicators actually are. I'm going to give you one more example that I think is kind of a cool one here. Self-defense and safety. A city has a baseline. People have a baseline in their behavior. Some people, like, they get up really early in the morning and they have their coffee and they work out. Other people, they wake up slow and they're really grumpy in the morning, but by midday, they're very social. And if I chat with that person in the morning, they might actually be kind of rude to me. If I chat at them at 3 o'clock, they're probably going to be really friendly. That's the baseline of that person throughout the day, right? Understanding baseline in a person can help with social interactions. Understanding baseline in an urban environment can help with safety. There's this whole discipline in science, in both martial arts, but also even military science right now, where they're training soldiers to go into a community and really quickly try and pick up on what are the indicators that show me what normal baseline and activity is, so that I can look for the anomaly in that, because that anomaly might be the signal of the threat there in a community where everything else looks the same. So the challenge that I want to leave you with as I kind of wrap up my talk here tonight is, one, to think about that chart. If you didn't make a note, I'm going to throw it up on the screen here, even as I'm finishing up here. So baseline activity. If you didn't write this down, take a picture of this or write it down right now. This sketch is, you're going to have to map this out for your area. But I would encourage you for the next week or so, couple times a day, step outside your front door and just sit and observe your street. And you're going to find your street has a baseline. There's times of day where, there's a lot of cars and people. There's times of day where there's nothing going on. There's probably neighborhood cats that move around and hunt. There's probably birds. There's probably raccoons. There's going to be a baseline to that flow throughout the time of day on your specific street. You go downtown, the baseline is going to be a little bit different, right? So have a little bit of fun. What is that baseline around your community? And noticing an anomaly in that baseline might actually tell you that there's something up that's worth you paying attention to. So do that in your street and around your home, and then go do that in a natural area. And try to go there different times of the day. Go there first thing in the morning, go there midday, go there late afternoon, go there as the sun's going down. And as you go to a place over and over, you'll start to understand the baseline. The more you practice this, the quicker you'll pick up on the baseline of an area. I can't stress enough like how profound and deep this actually is as you start to wrap your head and how much information is coming to us, and we can pick up on the baseline and then pick up on the anomalies within the baseline. So I'm already going over here, and which I foreshadowed in my opening talk there. I need to pass it over to Caleb in a moment here. That's your homework challenge for those of you that choose to accept it, to think about this concept of baseline. To segue over to Caleb, baseline can be applied to reading the landscape as well. Plants, trees. Understanding baseline is important for foraging mushrooms because, certain mushrooms grow in certain ecological communities. You could call that the baseline. The ecological community is associated with this mushroom. If I find this mushroom, but it's in the wrong ecological community, it's out of baseline, oh, maybe that's not actually the mushroom I thought it was. So this even applies to foraging, like so many different things, right? So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I'm just going to plant the seed. I've got a course coming up, Reading Nature's Language, where I'm going to be going really deep with a small group of people on this. That's an online course. And I also have a couple of wildlife tracking days for those of you that live in Ontario that want to get out on the land with me for a day and explore this. I got 2 of those coming up. I'll share the link in the chat here, and I'll send it out afterwards in the email if you want to check out either of those courses. I'm going to chat about them in a little more depth at the end of the call, but I'm going to pass it over to my good friend Caleb here.
Miigwech, Chris. You put me up on a pedestal there at the beginning talking about me. So let's see how fast I get knocked down. Anin bojo, kinene indigenous cause bazuna shi and dorem, Mississauga Nishnabe and then Dao Pamara Skoldeong and Donjaba, Pimada Skoldeong and Donjaba, depending on your dialect. Anin bojo, and Ana bojo. My name is Caleb from Hiawatha First Nation, the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, Pimadash or Pamadash Skoldeong. And this has been our homeland since time immemorial, since before there were stories. And my line of work is multi-tiered. I do a lot of things. I wear a lot of hats. I work in outdoor education in general, teaching everything from wilderness survival. We do week-long survival expeditions and courses, teaching people simple skills or simple bush safety skills. Like this coming weekend, we got an axe safety course coming up that still has room for registrations if you're looking, all the way to building birch bark canoes. Dealing with my dogs here on the homestead. Mama just came home, so they're losing their mind. So you'll hear a little bit of barking for a moment. And then beyond that, I work in archaeology and I work in natural indigenous landscape consultation. So I work with people talking about how to re-wild environments as well as relationships with the land. With that, I work in trapping. I am a hunter. I do both trapping for my own personal benefits as well as beyond for animal control, for helping people in the area who are dealing with animal problems where their relationship is out of balance. And then beyond that, I work in archaeology where I've studied for a little over, I'd say a little under 20 years now. I've studied human life in general on the landscape, focusing heavily on ethnobotany. Ethnobotany is the human relationship with plants. And with all of that, all those little hats I have to wear, I do a lot of different kind of work. And it's given me a lot of opportunities to work all over North America. I've got to examine and study all over the Western United States, studying a lot of different amazing spots, Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan people or ancient Puebloan people, all the way up into buffalo jumps in the South Dakota, Wyoming region, as well as studying all the way back to Paleo-American periods, like 12,000 plus years of human life on this landscape, studying that and seeing how we interact with that landscape and what we do with that landscape and how we've changed the landscape. One thing I want to put into your head right now is that you don't live in a place that is wild. The idea that North America was wilderness is a fallacy. It was never wilderness. It was all managed by Anishinaabeg and other indigenous peoples across this landscape. When Verrazano and many other early explorers came to the eastern seaboard, they experienced this massive park-like estate that they would write about as being the Garden of Eden, given to them by God. Hell no, it was given to them by us. We made it. And so our relationship with this landscape goes so deep that we made this landscape. We changed this landscape so drastically with our interactions with it that it changed completely. And it is something completely different. A great example to confirm that is purple martins. The purple martin, a member of the swallow family, has had a massive decline in the last 100+ years. My cat's trying to get up here and get my attention. In the last 100+ years, because traditionally Anishinaabe people, Lenni Lenape people, Haudenosaunee people, Kickapoo, Miami, Illinois, all the different nations in the eastern woodlands along the Mississippi would hang their gourds from their gardens to dry, to make into cups, bowls, spoons, ladles, dippers, all kinds of things. And they would put a hole in there to allow it to dry out. And these would make perfect nests for purple martins. And they did that for so long that when we stopped doing that because of colonization, the purple martin numbers declined because they didn't have nesting habitat, because they couldn't go back to the wilderness living in hollow tree stumps and such anymore. They couldn't do that like their other wild relatives could. So we have drastically changed the landscape. So I want to put that little seed in your head that you aren't dealing with wilderness. You're dealing with a massive garden, a massive ecosystem that was terraformed by people that has been gone feral. It's a feral landscape now. We live in a North America and South America is effectively a post-apocalyptic landscape that is slowly retaking itself. That's why we find all these amazing, cities that everybody's stunned by down in South America. Why? Because when disease came through and wiped the people out, the rainforest took it back and reclaimed it. And now we're finding all these sites within the jungles. So that's kind of beyond what we're trying to talk about. That's like the macro version, or not even macro, the meta, like the massive, big, way back, big picture, deep time kind of considerations of tracking the landscape and learning the landscape. Into all that comes this concept of what Chris has been talking about. The baseline symphony is what I often refer to. That symphony because I like music, and I think of like that bass line in the music gives you an idea. And then when you hear things coming out of place, it's like when you hear that one guy on the clarinet squeak and squelch and he gets it wrong, or is the tuba or the trumpet gets out of sync, you notice it immediately when you're listening to that music. And so that's a really good way to look at everything, and everything can be tracked. Tracking is our oldest science. Humankind's very first science that we developed was visually observing everything. We don't have strong olfactory systems. They're good. They're actually better than you think they are. You just got to train your nose and train your system to actually pay attention. But we don't have the nose of a hound or a wolf or even a wildcat, who have actually pretty poor sense of smell in comparison to the other predators. We don't have the really sharp hearing ability of deer and even owls and other animals out on the landscape who have those massive ears or specialized ears. And so we don't have that, but we have really good binocular vision. And that allowed us to see those things that are out of place. And our eyes are really good at that. If any of you have ever gone hunting or just gone sport shooting, when you're using iron sights, a lot of people try to line all three, the front post, the front sight on the barrel of the firearm, and the hind sight, the one closest to you, which has a little groove, almost like a V or a notch. And they try to line them up, trying to get them all even. But if you tell them to just make the two voids of space between them even, your eyes line it up perfectly, because we're good at looking for those things out of place, those voids. That is what our eyes are really good at locking in on. You can see the sky through the trees better than you can sometimes see the trees, because the sky is so blue and so obvious, or the clouds are so white and they're so obvious. But those leaves can get really distracting and confusing because they're all so not necessarily uniform, but they're all there and you're used to seeing them. They stand. It's like seeing your nose. You don't think about your nose being there until you look at it and think about it. So tracking is that's the origins of tracking, is observing everything, not just animal footprints like Chris was talking about. Like, it's not just that. And it's listening to the bird song, it's listening to the bird activity and all those things. Hi there, cattail. Anyways, all those things correlate and all those things are connected. And there's some ones that are really wild to think about when it comes down to how they connect. And there's a study around it that's a little woo-woo. almost sounds like folk magic kind of stuff, where it's referred to as semiology, which is the reading of signs, often natural signs, not always natural signs, but usually signs from nature. And some of those can be really big, some of them can be really microscopic, and how you look at them, what you're looking for, and what you're trying to observe. So a great example of like a bigger picture one is, let's say we buy a property here in central Ontario where I live. A lot of the forests around here are mixed hardwood plains with a few different kinds of conifers in it. And then you get up into the highlands, like the Haliburton Highlands, the Kawartha Highlands, all that. And you still see that mixed hardwood kind of northernmost Carolinian blending into the land between, which is the boreal forest, mashing into those hardwoods. And in there, we see a property, and we buy this property, we inherit this property, however we get this property. And we're thinking, okay, well, we live in central Ontario. One of the best industries in central Ontario in the springtime that anyone can do with the right kind of forest is a sugar bush. We can make a sugar bush. We can set up a sugar bush. And so we go, okay, we bought this, let's say, well, most of us can't do this these days, but let's say we found a 500-acre property for a good price. And it's a big property, really big property, even 100 acres, 75 acres. And you look at it all and you go, crap, where would there be sugar maples? And you look at the cedar bush that's near the house, doesn't seem to be the right place for that. So let's say you get up, you have a hill on the property, and get way up on that hilltop, and you can look over it all. And it's this time of year because you bought it now, and the sugar bush is coming up soon, so you're thinking about it now. Good time to think about it is January, not, first week of March. And you look over that landscape and you start pinpointing trees that you do know. Now, the hardwoods are hard to identify in the wintertime from afar. You have to walk through those hardwoods, and you can identify sugar maple compared to red maple by its bark, the buds, the branch display. You can compare it to ash, you can compare it to oak and other trees out there. But when we're looking at a grand scheme, it's really hard to tell with all those just bare branches. And so what I do is I look for hemlocks. I look for Tsuga canadensis, which is the eastern hemlock. Some people call it the eastern white hemlock, which gets me confused because that's not its name. And we already have eastern white pine and eastern white cedar. And let's not get confusing with more things. It's an eastern hemlock. Gagagaminch is what we say it in our language about it. And I'm looking at that landscape, and I start to pin out these hemlock trees, which are conifers. They keep their boughs, they keep their needles, their foliage through the wintertime. They're a lot easier to identify this time of year because you can learn from a distance spruce, pine, cedar, hemlock. You can figure that all out. And they're really dark. Like white pines this time of year, kind of bright. Cedars are kind of a mottled olive drab almost. Firs and spruce, they kind of have their color. Hemlocks are really dark. Like it just seems like there's a shadow over their foliage all the time. And so you see them. And if you know your natural landscape and you know ecosystems, you know that sugar maples often grow with hemlocks. And so there is a place that we can start to look. And we may confirm it. Maybe somebody stripped out all the maples from logging several generations before, a decade before, or last month. Who knows? You just got the property. But when you see those hemlocks, you can start to go down. And now we go down into the sugar bush. And you're like, okay, yeah, there's these sugar maples. Some of them are red maples, some of them are black maples, but we got maple trees, and all maples can produce sap that can give us sugar or syrup or whatever you want to get out of it. Okay. When the hell do you start? With all of the things that happen throughout the year. This year, we're dealing with El Nino. The El Nino effect is causing us to have really weird fluctuations. Like this week is really cold in my part of Ontario, not as cold as is down towards Hamilton and Kitchener-Waterloo, from what I've been hearing from friends down there, and very dear people to me down that way. That's really cold down there, and they're having like extreme weather warnings and stuff. Up here, it's like, it feels like minus 25. Next week, it may rain up here. And the week after that, it might drop even colder. Like we don't know necessarily what's going to happen because of El Nino. Because you can have some short starts. That happens a lot. People will go out right now and tap their trees because everything's thawed. And they'll go out and tap, and they get like one day of sap, and then it drops down to minus 30. And all those taps freeze up, and the bark there gets damaged because the sap has been running up and it's been bleeding out and saturating that area. And now you've harmed the tree. And it's not going to run from there anymore because the tree has shut that area off to protect itself from hemorrhaging any more sap and causing more bark damage. So by the time sugar bush comes up, where you tapped is not going to run. Okay, so how do we figure this out? How do we figure out when we can tap? Well, My family, we're Nishnawbek. We've been running sugar bushes since time immemorial, since before there were stories. As I said earlier, we've always been doing those things. I've been working in sugar bushes since I was 14 years old. I'm 35 now, going on 36. So I've been working for over 20 years in sugar bushes. I've managed sugar bushes. I've run sugar bushes under other people, all kinds of different stuff. And I've got to listen to my elders talk about why we choose when we go out. And that is when you see large flocks of crows in the fields or along the sides of roads or in town. When you start seeing large groups of crows, you've got about a week to get everything ready, and then you better start tapping. This sounds really hoodoo. Like, this sounds really like woo-woo kind of stuff. Like, oh, that just sounds like a old like wives' tale or whatever term you want to use. What's going on, though, is this through semiology, observing that the crows are going to be here at this time. And when they're here in large numbers, we know that the sap is going to run soon, is actually quite simple. And it's a very basic thing. Crows do migrate. They don't migrate like the ducks and geese. They don't migrate like songbirds do, where they go in huge droves down south to like Panama and Florida and the Gulf of Mexico and California. Arizona apparently is one area that I've heard that loons from this region will migrate to, which blows my mind that you'd go to Arizona and you're a water bird. But anyways, they go south. Crows, they fly to maybe Indiana, Kentucky, sometimes Tennessee, sometimes as far over towards like the Carolinas. And the reason being is crows, unlike ravens, are not heavy carnivores. They do eat meat because they're very omnivorous, but they prefer to eat things like grains. They're more granivore than anything else. And because they eat those grains, those corn, rye, barley, oats, things like that, and then natural wild seeds, of course, as well, they're not getting that up here with the deep snow and the deep cold. And it's just not conducive to them surviving. And so they fly across Lake Ontario, usually through Presqu'île, in small bands, not in a giant flock like geese will, especially snow geese. They can block out the sun for about an hour if they want to. They just go down in groups of like 10 to 20, going down to their areas, Pennsylvania and New York. And then as the cold follows, they just keep kind of going further south. But then as it starts to warm up in the spring, the bugs are getting bad down there and they start to migrate back. That's why a lot of birds migrate back to the north, is because there's a lot of competition down there for food and the bugs are getting bad. So they start to come back north, ironically to blackfly country come springtime. As those crows come back, they're coming back because they're noticing that it's warm during the daytime and it's only a little bit cold at night. It's not minus 20, minus 30 anymore. And the grass is starting to show in the fields. The snow is receding from where the sun can cook it for a while. And those old grains of corn, old grains of rye that were left in the field might still be available. And then, of course, bugs and all the other food. Of course, as the snow recedes, death is found. Animals that died in the winter or kills from coyotes or wolves are suddenly exposed from the snowmelt. And so the crows can find food now. And they show up right around a week before sugarbush. And that's because the timing is right with the conditions. It's warm enough during the daytime, but still cold enough at night, but it's not freezing. It's not in the single digits. It's not like the minus 20s, minus 30s. I don't know why I said single digits there, but anyways, all of that tells us when we can go out and tap our trees. Like when I see flocks of crows on the road in Hiawatha Line heading to town or coming back from town, and I see those flocks, or I see them in the field around my house, or I see them in my yard even. Okay, the crows are coming back in big numbers. I better go out and clean my cast iron cauldrons. I better go sanitize all my buckets. I better go out and make sure I got all my spiles accounted for. And I better start scouting which maple trees I want to tap this year and get my firewood ready and get my sugar bush set up and make sure everything's running well. And that takes me about a week. And then boom, it's time to tap. And then boom, it's time to gather sap. And then boom, it's time to boil the sap. And then boom, now I got sugar, syrup, all those amazing things, maple butter, all that kind of stuff. And I've got the resources to make maple vinegar and all those other amazing things that come along with it. And as that season continues, we come to the end of sugarbush around when the big lakes start to really break up and free themselves of ice. And you start having open water all over the place. And that ice break happens around the same time that the walleye begin to run. And what do we mean by run? Walleye don't have feet. They start to spawn. And so Anishinaabe people, we spearfish. We harvest walleye, we harvest sucker, we harvest many species of fish with spears. And so for us, as soon as the sugar bush is done, We start making sure that our spears are ready. We start scouting those rivers, those rocky bottom rivers that the walleye are going to start moving up. And as soon as the walleye are done, other fish are ready. The chub suckers start to come up, which is the Tullabee fish, which is actually what the name of the river closest to me is named after. The Otonabee River is Otonabee Zibi or Zibi, and that's talking about the sucker, the chub sucker or the Tullabee River. This is where we go to get Tullabee, and the Tullabee run right after the walleye finish. So as soon as you start seeing a descent in walleye, you can start scouting for those other fish, the Tullabee coming up. And everything goes in hand in hand in hand. And over the last 15 years running my own business, Canadian Bushcraft, teaching our own bush skills, and then beyond that, when I was teaching for other schools and learning at other schools, there was often this question, and it gets brought up a lot now because of social media and television, bringing up a lot more survival television, TV survival. And I get people all the time like, when's the best time to get dropped off in the wilderness to try and survive? And I've thought about that for a long time. And I used to say springtime, just before the bugs get bad. But even then, you're in a deficit. You're missing stuff that you should have had before then. To get dropped off in the middle of nowhere with all the equipment you need and even some food, you're still going to be in a deficit until you have caught up for at least 1 year and you get a full year under your belt. And then you have all the stuff you need. You're going to miss things all the time. Every single season, you're missing the season before. And so before I go too further into ranting about all these different nuances, let's just talk about a lot of them. I have a whole list here. I have a whole list of ones I've taken down over the last couple of years of observing what I've seen around me. So the first one that comes up on the list is what I was just talking about, the hemlock trees to sugar maple, which takes you to the next thing. Now, sugar maple gives you another nuance. We're talking about tracking the landscape. Once I find sugar maples, there's a good chance I'm going to find leeks. I'm going to find possibly even fiddleheads on the lower side of where those trees are, because sugar maples like to be up on hilltops or on ridges. They don't necessarily like to be down where their feet are going to be soaking wet, which is where the red maples, aka swamp maple, like to live. But because they have this amazing thing, sugar maple being up on hills, they require a lot of water. They're a big tree, but they don't like their feet being wet, sopping wet. And so their root system, they got the Jebic and Wadop. Wadop is like the horizontal roots that help anchor them into the ground and help draw in certain nutrients from the surface. The Jebic, that vertical root that goes down deep into the ground, that is there to draw nutrients and water up from below. And sugar maples do this amazing thing called hydraulic lift. It's like a water elevator, and they pull up gallons of water, and then just about a foot below the surface, they expunge it. They dump it all over the ground in the soil about a foot deep. And this gives them all that water to create all the sap that we gather. But it also becomes an irrigation system for all these little ephemerals, spring ephemerals that are growing below them. So you're going to find leeks. You're going to find mayapple. You're going to find bloodroot. You're going to find all these medicinal plants and other kinds of plants growing under the sugar maple trees. And because the sugar maples don't put out their leaves until much later in the spring, they'll bud out, but they don't fully unfurl until, later. It gives those spring ephemerals a chance to get all that sun that's up above them while being hydrated from below. And that hydration doesn't end just because the sugar bush has ended. It just continues to pump a little less, and it gives those plants below a chance. So if you're looking for leeks, you're looking for fiddleheads even down at the lower parts, find your sugar maples and then start gravitating down and looking, and you're going to start seeing stuff. You're going to start seeing a lot of different resources. Next one that I have on the list, blueberries and black flies. There's an old myth that the male black flies pollinate blueberries. That's not the case. At least not enough for it to be a big deal. But the reason people talk about black flies and blueberries, they often say if the black flies are biting real bad or the black flies are real bad this season, look out for blueberries. And that's because both of them require the same thing, a lot of water. Blueberries require a lot of water to grow, develop, blossom, produce their fruit, and then finish their process of creating fruit and having those fruit go out to germinate elsewhere. Black flies need a lot of water too. So there's a lot of water on the landscape. There's going to be a lot of black flies breeding, and there's going to be a lot of mosquitoes breeding as well. But if there's a lot of water on the landscape, the blueberries are going to be doing well as well. So there's a correlation there, though it's not the causation. And that's like what people get confused when they see things that are correlating. They assume that they're connected, and they are, but tangentially. They're connected because they both require, just like the crows and the sap. Another one that's just like an observation, a tracking observation that I always love bringing up is crows going wild in a big mob. Look for birds of prey like owls and hawks. And this was actually something that saved a bunch of my birds last winter. back in last February, I believe it was, I was in my kitchen doing the dishes, and I have two geese and a bunch of ducks on our little homestead. And I heard crows going wild. And I looked out the window and there was like 30, 40 crows all over the yard around my property. And so I'm like, what's going on? Is there a bird of prey? And I ran to my bedroom window, which overlooks my birds, and there was a hawk in my pen with all of my ducks and geese. And I'm panicking. I'm going out to chase it off. And when I get out there, this hawk is perched real funny, sitting on top of what looks like a duck. I'm like, oh man, he got one of my ducks already. And then he started to lazily fly away, leaving behind what I thought was his kill or their kill. Actually, probably was a female because it was quite big. It was quite a large red-tailed hawk. So I jump into the pen, go to check on that duck, and it's a stump. The hawk just happened to be perched on a stump. I'm like, okay, so he must have got chased off. They must have got chased off by me or the crows. I better check my birds though, and only one of them had blood on them, and that was my goose. And that's when I learned something else. Geese are okay alarm birds when you have like a fox or a raccoon or a coyote around. They don't always do their job, but they are amazing aerial deterrents. That goose had blood on her breast, and none of it was hers. It was the hawk's. She had plucked that hawk's breast and beat that hawk with her wings, and there was blood all over her breast, feathers sticking out of her bill. She protected the rest of the flock. Has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but that was the end of the story. It was because I noticed the crows and I knew there must be a bird of prey. I better go check. Going down the rest of the list, sugarbush and crows, we already talked about that one. Spring peepers and smelts. This is something I learned from Chris a few years ago, and it's one of my favorite little pieces of semiology. When the spring peepers, those little tiny frogs, start to make their sound off in the woods, you just hear one or two. Go get your smelting net, start checking the creeks at night. And that's something Chris taught me, I think 3 years ago. And it's been in my head all the time. When I hear the spring peepers, I'll give Chris a ring or I'll give Chris a text. Hey, are the spring peepers peeping up your way yet? Because we don't have good smelt creeks where I am, but he's got some decent ones up his way. Semiology, Semiology. Semiology. Car just went by. Hey, you're done. Go on. Tracker, you're done. Go on, buddy. The dog's name is Tracker. Good timing. Go on. Good job. Thank you for guarding us. Thank you for guarding us from a car that drove by and didn't do anything. Beyond that, so spring peepers and smelt. So spring peepers and smelt, that's a great one to be able to know that if you hear those spring peepers, start preparing for the smelt run. Going on down my list, smoke. Here we go. These are some cool ones for me. Smoke hangs low. So like we have a fire and the smoke starts to just hang around. It's almost like heavy fog. That's usually an indicator of weather coming. Someone's driving really slow. Something's going on here. That's the smoke is hanging real low. It's usually because a low pressure front is happening. We have something going on with the weather. We have something going on coming. Sush, go. Sushi, go on. Our other dog's named Sushi. We haven't figured that out. Can you get them to the bedroom, please?
Just up there, right up here. Bed. Someone's parked on the road.
Yeah, they dropped something off, it looked like.
Bed. Bed bugs.
I could hear the dogs quite loud. So anyways, where was I? When it comes down to the semiology of the smoke, that's usually an indicator of a low pressure front coming, which can mean weather is on the way. Doesn't necessarily mean bad weather, but it means weather is on the way. But when smoke starts to spiral and circle, especially counterclockwise, that can be an indicator that you have really strong, rough weather on the way. Whenever we're at the camp, we're out camping in general out on the land. When I'm hunting, if I have a little fire going and I start noticing that smoke swirling around real aggressively, going, north, then going to the west, and then going to the south and the east, and then going back to the north. It's hit me in the face every once in a while, but it's coming from over there and hit me in the face. That's when I start looking for my rain jacket. That's when I start looking for a tarp. That's why when we're camping, I make sure all my gear is in my tent or my hammock or whatever it is that I'm staying in. I batten down the hatches because you may have an hour if you're lucky, really lucky. On that note of telling weather and tracking the weather, when I notice that oak leaves are moving, that just means that there's fair weather or wind coming through. But when I see them turn over and show the bottom side and you see the thick veins of the bottom of the leaf, that means rough weather's coming. And that was actually the first thing that told me way back when the 2022 derecho hit Ontario. 5 minutes before it hit, I saw all the oak leaves flip their leaves, and I went, I'm getting my rain jacket. Let's get a tarp over everything. And then bam, we got hit. And man, did we get hit. That was rough, really rough. So all these weather indicators happening from the landscape. Another one with that is when the mosquitoes are in the daytime biting really bad. Mosquitoes usually bite dawn, then stop for a while, then pick back up around dusk, and then get really rough during the nighttime because they don't like being out in the sun too much. They don't like it very much. Black flies will bite a lot in the daytime, and deer flies and moose flies will hit you right in the broad daylight, right out in the open sun. Horse flies the same. But mosquitoes are a little bit daintier, and so they don't like to be out in the broad open sun too much. Even in wetlands, I don't get overwhelmed by mosquitoes until about dawn or dusk or nighttime, which is great because my camp is located surrounded by a wetland. We're basically this island of sugar maples and hemlocks surrounded by swamp. And when I feel those bugs starting to really bite at 10 o'clock in the morning, noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, I pay attention to that. And that's usually because those mosquitoes know that if this storm comes in, they're going to be bad. They're going to be battered by the wind, battered by the rain. And so they want to get all their blood they can get right now, even though it's much riskier for them. It's safer to do it now than try to go out and find food when the raindrops are coming down and the hail and the sleet and whatever else is going to be coming with that storm. So they can be indicators of the weather. It's the insects, the plant life, the bird life, and there's many, many more. If you see cattle in a field all spread out on the lower parts of the field and laying down, you're possibly going to be seeing a thunderstorm or a lightning storm at the minimum. If you see them milling on the leeward side of a hill, so the side opposite of where the wind is coming from, and they're milling together, cold weather is coming in. Some sort of cold weather system is going to be coming in and battering the area. That could be a snowstorm, an ice storm, a blizzard. Who knows what it could be? But the cows know. They notice that stuff. Birds are flying real high, especially songbirds are flying real high over the treetops doing their thing. And you see hawks or eagles or vultures way up in the sky circling. Fair weather. Most likely fair weather. Now, if you see ducks flying real high, that's usually because there's high winds and they like to fly. They like to move and migrate in the fall and spring when the winds are real strong in their favor. But if you see birds lining up real low on fence rows or even on, almost at cell phone towers, telephone poles, they're getting lower to the ground. That's because they do not want to be up too high when those big storms come in and hit. If you see ducks and geese milling on a sheltered side of a cove or a bay or an inlet, you may have weather coming in. So just observing how those animals are acting and observing what they're doing, whether it's the insects, the birds, the mammals, observing those animals, the amphibian activity as well, going back to the spring peepers and the smelts, it can tell you and indicate things that are going on. The stars are also an indicator from an Anishinaabeg perspective and an Indigenous worldview. The stars are also a calendar system that can tell us when to be doing certain things. So example that I've always loved to talk about is Ursa Major, the Big Dipper. In Anishinaabeg traditions, there's a few different names for it. Some people talk about the Fisher. I was taught growing up it's a bear. So the cup of the Big Dipper, those 4 stars are the main body of the bear. There's a few other stars that make the full body of the bear. And then there's the tail, the handle. And that tail is 3 stars. And those 3 stars are 3 hunters chasing the bear. And what's going on is the bear is being chased across the sky starting in February, which is from Corona Borealis, which is in our language, the bear's den. And it leaves Corona Borealis, it's alive, and it runs across the sky. And then in September, about mid-September, that bear is on its back and it's dead. The hunters have killed it. And what happens is the sumac leaves and the maple leaves are painted red with the blood of that bear. And that's when we know that we should start preparing for big game hunting. You know, the bull moose, the bull elk, the white-tailed deer, the caribou further north, their antlers are fully shed of velvet. They're in the full rut. They're they're in their pre-rut phase. All that's going on. And we can go out and hunt knowing that we're going after those bucks and those bulls. And we're not necessarily at risk of causing trouble with taking does or cows when they may have young. With all that said, we have to remember that at the end of that, when that bear leaves Corona Borealis, the bear is alive. And so in February, when we see that constellation leaving where Corona Borealis is, We know that the cows are getting ready to have, the cows and the does are getting ready to have their young. They are fully pregnant, but also it becomes more challenging to choose a bull or a buck because their antlers have shed. They drop their antlers midwinter, and by February, it's very hard to discern without looking at a lot of other features and knowing what you're doing. It's harder to tell whether it's a buck or a doe, a bull or a cow. And so we stop big game hunting because we're observing the stars and they're telling us, okay, this is going to be happening next. So be prepared for that. Cattling down, talked about that already. Songbirds, waterfowl, ice breaking on the lakes and the walleye run, talked about that with spearing. Ring around the moon can indicate precipitation. So we actually saw that tonight when I went outside to let the dogs out one last time. We saw a halo around the moon. And that is an old indicator from a lot of traditions, a lot of cultures around the world that there's going to be precipitation within the next 24 hours. And so we look up, we see that ring, and we know, okay, we better get some tarps over the wood. We better make sure we got some extra firewood in the wood stove. We better make sure everything's ready for some snow or rain because it's about to come in the next 24 hours. Spring flood recedes. So in the springtime, you get all that snow melt running down the rivers from the lakes. The lakes overflow and then they spread down through the rivers and the tributaries and all the waterways. And that happens. And you now have all this flooding. And as soon as that recedes, that's when the sucker, the red horse sucker, the white sucker, lake sucker are starting their spawn up into the gravel beds after all the debris has been washed away and the gravel is exposed on the bottom of the creek and stream. They can see where they can lay their eggs. And so they come up to spawn. And again, if you're spearfishing, that's an important indicator. That's a very important indicator. Somebody's knocked on my door, I think. Anyways, another one, if you're talking about homesteading and gardening, this is not a native plant or shrub, but it's a very good indicator that I've learned from my mother, who is non-Indigenous. She's Jagannash. She's a Anglo-Canadian. And what I learned from her and a lot of her family, who are all these old school farmers and gardeners and homesteaders, was lilacs, the lilac bushes. When the lilacs first start to bud out their leaves and really open up before the flower buds out and blossoms, it's just a bud. We know that the ground is warm enough to start planting or sowing seeds for cold weather plants. So brassicas, your cabbages, cauliflower, your Brussels sprouts, your broccoli, even your kale, even to a degree, some other plants. And that's the ones that you can sow really easily. You can also sow some warm weather plants at that point because they're not going to germinate for a while. But when the blossoms open, when the lilac blossoms open, the ground is warm enough to plant your hot weather plants or sow your hot weather plants, whichever one. So I can start putting out, when I see the lilac bush in the front yard blow open its flowers and really show, and that nice aroma is in the air, I know that I can plant corn, transplant my tomatoes, transplant my peppers, and they're not going to have to deal with frost anymore because the ground is warm enough to support their root systems to stay alive. Cattail leaf tips begin to turn brown. When you see the tips of the cattail leaf start to brown out because they're nice and green and vibrant throughout July, getting to the end of August, you start to see the brown start to form. And that's an important thing, if you want to gather cattail leaf to make duck decoys, cattail dolls, if you want to make traditional cattail mats for making a lodge roof, anything like that. But what it is for me is I need to make sure that my ricing sticks are ready. I need to make sure that my winnowing trays and all my other equipment for going after Manome and wild rice are ready, because that cattail leaf going brown is around the same time that the top seeds of the Manomen start to ripen. And as they begin to ripen, everything slowly trickles down and the other seeds start to ripen down the stalk. You can harvest Manomen from the same plant 3 times, 4 times, sometimes even 5 times if you tap it the right way and you come at the right times and you time it right. And how I time it right is to start as soon as I start seeing the cattail leaves turning brown, I start going out into the cattail pads, into the wild rice pads, out into those beds and checking on them and seeing how they're doing and giving them some experimental taps to see if they're ready. And if they're not ready, now I'm ahead of them. I'm ahead of the game. Therefore, I'm not going to miss them. Because, man, have I missed ricing multiple times over the years because I didn't pay attention. Birches and poplar change their color, seek acorns. As the birch and the poplar start to turn yellow in their leaves, their foliage starts to turn into their fall colors. Not when they're fully bright and yellow, when they're just starting to start looking for acorns on the ground. When I had another one here. Where did it go? I had another one on my list. It's gone now. I had another one for hickory nuts, which I believe is when the oak leaves and the alder leaves start to change their color, and you start to see the maples turning red. Check for hickory nuts. It's also when the first frost hits. When the first frost hits, check for hickory nuts. They're going to start coming up the shagbark hickory, the shellbark hickory, the pig nut hickory, even the bitter nut hickory, the yellow bud hickory. A lot of people talk smack about the bitter nut hickory because it tastes bitter. The oil doesn't. And that's a massive oil producer, is the yellow bud hickory, which is the most common hickory this far north in North America. I have dozens of yellow bud hickories all over my property and all over the landscape around me, and I harvest them to make oil, not eat the nut meat, but to eat consume the oil. Yeah, first frosty hickory nuts. Oh, it's right below it. I missed it completely. Whiskey jacks or Canada jays, the same bird, also known as the gray jay, start picking cattail fluff and twigs for nests. That's when the wolf mating season starts to happen. So mid-February, you start to see a lot of cattail fluff getting ripped off. Down this far south, it's usually from chickadees and red-winged blackbirds. But further north, up towards where Chris lives and up towards the north shore of the Great Lakes, that's the whiskey jack, especially when you see big clumps missing or you see twigs getting broken off. You see the whiskey jacks carrying a lot of branches, little twigs and stuff all over the place, pine needles. That's when the wolves are going to start breeding. And that's because, again, the timing, the temperatures are just right. That's when you want to be looking for it. Maple buds burst another way. So when the maple buds first break open, the sugar maple, they first break open, start to show their leaves. That's when the sucker run. Just like we were talking about earlier, when the flooding recedes, that's when the sucker runs. So there's a lot of things that we can connect. So if I see that the water levels are dropping quick, I can go check the maples and see if their leaves have budded out yet, if they've opened up or burst. And if they haven't, maybe the water levels just weren't high enough, or maybe because I'm on the Trent Severn Waterway, maybe for some reason the Trent Severn Waterway dropped the locks. Maybe I was wrong, just to indicate that one thing. Always have something else to cite what you're talking about. Same thing when we're talking about navigation. Don't just depend on the compass. Check the sun's orientation. Check everything else. And that's one of those. I can check the buds bursting. Beavers start cutting fresh trees in the spring. The bears are going to start increasing their activity. The beavers are getting fresh food because they've been living off their feed raft all winter long. They're coming out getting fresh food, fresh poplar, fresh alder, fresh even tamaracks and spruce they're going after. That's because the ice is now open enough that they can come out and get a lot more food and be up on the land more and not have to worry about their hole freezing on them while they're gone. And that's also when the bears start to show their activity, not necessarily get in huge droves and start wandering out quite a bit, but their activity from their den starts to increase. They start coming out. Mama bear starts bringing the cubs out a little bit, or she's being more active around the den, getting grasses and other foods to eat. You start seeing the occasional mosquito. Fiddleheads are about to pop. That's one that I learned from my dad. As soon as you feel the one, like, they're not necessarily biting yet, but they're buzzing around, as zygomys is doing their job, start checking the wetland areas, the lowland areas for fiddleheads, for ostrich fern fiddleheads. Ground steams when the morning sun hits it in mid-spring. Leeks are about perfect. When you start to see that kind of haze on the forest floor, after the snow's receded, but before everything's fully thawed, like fully thawed, you'll see this kind of hazy mist on the forest floor. And you go, those leek leaves are nice and prime. They're nice and big. They're perfect. They're absolutely perfect. Fog or mist in the morning, especially in in late summer, that's an indicator that autumn is on the way, that fall is on the way. When you start to see that heavy fog or mist on lakes, start to see that heavy fog or mist in the forest when you're camping, you wake up and there's dew on everything and there's the mist just slowly receding from the sun, you might want to start looking for your wool. You might want to start checking out what your firewood supply looks like. It's like when your last little warnings, you better get enough firewood in. Maple and sumac leaves turn red. That's also when the moose rut begins. We're talking about the hunting season, but that's also when the moose start to rut. Spiders are more common in houses and sheds in late summer. Wild rice is ripening. If you're opening up your barns, you're opening up your tool shed, and you see spiders just everywhere. If you're in your house and you're just noticing more spiders in the house than usual, check the wild rice paddies. Check the wild rice beds. You might be seeing some stuff. Frost forms on shorelines and wetlands. The beaver and muskrat fur is getting prime. It's not fully prime yet, but when you start to see that little thin ice forming on the edges of the wetlands, if you're a trapper, that's your sign to get ready. Trapping season in this part of Ontario for muskrat and beaver starts October 25th. That's the rule. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the fur that's prime. It has nothing to do with the cold. It has nothing to do with the frost or the ice or the cold weather coming. It has everything to do with the sun's orientation. But the real indicator for those folks that are out trapping, like, do I get them now? Check when you're out duck hunting if there's a little bit of ice forming on the edges of the wetland. If you're seeing heavy frost all over the grass, that might be a good time, especially if it's during like later than October 25th. You know that the beaver muskrat are definitely primed now. It's time to go out and start trapping. The last three that I have, these are again indicators of stuff, just like everything else has been so far. Heavy mass crops of walnut, hickory nut, or acorns can often indicate, now there's mast years, 100%. There's mast years in different species and different subspecies of these trees have different mast years. Most red oak, their mast years every 7 years, but because of how we had LDD or spongy moth infestation 3 summers ago, we haven't had a mast year since. We've missed the mast year 3 years in a row now. It was supposed to be 2 years ago. We're going on to our 3rd year not having a mast year. So it doesn't always correlate, but when you see heavy amounts of walnuts, heavy amounts of butternut, heavy amounts of hickory nut dropping, it's going to be a pretty cold winter. It's going to be a long winter. Those nut trees know to put down a bunch of young, drop as much of their young as possible. They can tell months in advance, usually, and they will produce a lot of fruit, and those fruit drop to the ground, and that's to increase the odds that they will survive the freeze. Many of those trees require cold stratification, which is when they freeze up, their seeds freeze and they break open because then they can germinate in the spring. But if it gets too cold, they got to hedge their bets and produce a lot more babies so that they have a chance that some of them will germinate and survive in the spring to the springtime. Pileated woodpeckers are really active in a white or black ash stand. You may have emerald ash borer, which is an invasive beetle. The emerald ash borer beetle came over from Eastern Asia through the form of transporting pallets that were made of ash from Eastern Asia. The emerald ash borer then spread like wildfire. And nowadays, you just kind of assume that you have emerald ash borer if there's ash trees. You just assume it now in Ontario because it's that bad. But earlier, when we first started noticing them, one of the first things that we noticed is you would see pileated woodpeckers, the big woodpeckers, the ones that have that woody woodpecker laughter, and they got the big woody woodpecker head with a little crest at the back, and they're just so big you can't confuse them for a downy, you can't confuse them for a hairy, you can't confuse them for a flicker. They look like no other, or yellow-bellied sapsucker. They don't look like any of the other woodpeckers that we have in Ontario. They're just so big and bold, and you see them swarming, like you see 2, 3, 4 of them throughout a forest in one go, and you know it's different birds. Go up to your ash trees if you know what the ash trees look like, and you better start looking for uppercase D holes coming out of that bark. And you might start looking for bark balding happening, where all the bark is falling to the ground, and you're going to start looking for canopy die off. And these are all indicators that you have emerald ash borer. And now you got a problem. That was what it was 10, 12 years ago when we first started experiencing emerald ash borer in these woods. Now every ash tree has emerald ash borer where I live. Every single one, whether alive or dead, they have it. The final one that is a really good one to me, because a lot of people talk smack about invasive species, and I do too. I was just talking smack about emerald ash borers. It's not their fault that they're succeeding. It was our fault for bringing them and introducing them. I don't blame them. And so what I find really fascinating is when I look at certain species, these can be garlic mustard, this can be mullein, common mullein, this can be burdock. Very few of these invasive species or non-native species just get into a perfectly balanced ecosystem and thrive. It's very rare that it happens. They need to get a foothold in through disturbance. They need disturbed soil from us doing stuff, from bulldozers, from logging operations, all that kind of stuff gives that disturbed soil and gives them a chance to purchase their seeds into the ground, germinate, and thrive. Whether it's a purging buckthorn or a garlic mustard or any of that. A lot of those invasive species, but especially garlic mustard is what I notice around here. But it can also be a tree in a storm got uprooted and fell down. And maybe I don't notice the tree is down because I'm going through the woods and sometimes you don't see the trees. But I notice massive, thick stand of garlic mustard in one spot in a fairly established forest around me. I'm going to cruise right over there real fast, and then boom, oh, the tree is down. Okay, a tree came down, exposed soil, disturbed soil. The garlic mustard seeds that have been in the soil, in the seed bank, all this time from birds and activity, bird activity, animal activity, human activity, spreading the seeds because they're quite small and there's tens of thousands of them on one plant are getting spread. Okay, this makes sense now. Or I may come in and realize that someone's been doing some really weird work in the woods. And maybe I found the problem that we've been trying to find as ecosystem management folks. That's the kind of stuff that we can use when we look at our invasives, when they stand out, just like what Chris was talking about with that baseline. I'm going through a nice established woodland of Jack and the pulpits and yellow birch and big old red oaks and some yellow bud hickories. And I see some mayapple and leeks and blue cohosh and all these little plants on the forest floor. And then right in front of me, there's just a wall of garlic mustard. They didn't just get there and do that. Something had to happen to give them the foothold. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at when I'm doing ecosystem management, when I'm doing indigenous ecosystem landscape work, anything like that. I'm looking at those things. I'm observing those things. One of the most fascinating ones that is kind of further out there for me to fully comprehend was something that Laura, Chris's wife, brought up with me years ago. The invasive plant Japanese knotweed seems to show up where we find ticks that are positive for Lyme disease. And oddly enough, the root systems of Japanese knotweed can be used as a tincture to treat Lyme disease. And the leaves, according to Mal Stevens and a few other folks down in Maine, according to them, the leaves made into a tea can be drunk on a regular basis and again, ticks are active from 0 degrees Celsius and warmer. And they're able to bite and make purchase on bites at 4 degrees Celsius and warmer. So anytime it's above freezing, you have the possibility of coming across ticks. My dog Sushi got ticks her very first spring with us during the sugar bush when there was snow all over the ground. She got ticks. We found 7 of them on her the very first day. The very next day, we had her treated for ticks, and she got Lyme disease. And we treated her Lyme disease with Japanese knotweed root. Yeah. And you can use the tea, allegedly. I haven't seen much research on the leaves being used, but I'm assuming that the medicine that's in the leaves is the same as the medicine that's in the roots, maybe just diluted. But drinking it on a regular basis, on a daily basis, is said to help prevent Lyme disease. Don't take my word for that. Do your own research on that. These are what I've been told by other people that work around Japanese knotweed and deal with ticks. So these are all the little things that you can start to pick up through learning about the landscape, learning to read the landscape, learning to identify plants, learning to identify animals, learning to identify birds and their songs, everything, insects, all this kind of stuff. It's something that is a constant lesson. A lot of people say, like, Caleb knows a crap ton about survival skills and bushcraft. And I know a lot of stuff, and I've learned a lot of things, and I've forgotten a lot of things. But I'm always learning about the landscape. Always learning about the landscape. That never stops. You never become an expert in that. There's certain people in the world that I would consider experts in survival, experts in bushcraft instruction, specifically bushcraft and survival instruction. There's many indigenous peoples around the world that are experts in bushcraft because it's their lived experience. But when it comes down to teaching it, there's very few that I would consider experts. And the beauty of that is you can eventually attain that title if you work hard enough, study, and that becomes your obsession in your life, just like it's become mine. I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to become an expert one day. But you'll never be an expert on the land. You'll never be an expert on the land. When I was in South America, my first time going to South America, my friend Dan got bit on the middle toe by a spider in the village, in a Yacuna village. And we brought in the leader of the Yacuna village. You can call him the Jefe. Luis was his name. And we said to him, we found the spider. It was a big spider, crumpled up dead in Dan's boot and 2 bite marks on his middle toe. And we said to Luis, what kind of spider is that? And he looked at it and went, We just spent 3 days with this guy where he taught us everything about the jungle, everything about the rainforest, from the gardens they had to the ecology to the how to use all these different trees and plants and animals and everything else. He taught us so much. The weaving skills alone were mind-boggling. But he didn't know this spider. And I was like, this spider happened in your village. And he said, there are thousands of species of spider down here. Many hundred of them live in the village. How many spiders do you know back home? And I was like, garden orb weaver, dock spider, daddy long like I'm listing, if I can count them on my hand, I don't know that many spiders. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And so even this man who knew everything to survive and thrive in the bush didn't know all of his spiders. Now we found out later it was a juvenile wandering spider, or a subspecies of wandering spider, which means it was one of the deadliest out there, one of the most damaging to deal with. And luckily, because it's a juvenile, it was not able to inject enough venom to harm Dan. Thank goodness. But at that time, it was this mind-opening moment of like, you're never the expert. You're never the expert. And some people are like, wow, that's really disheartening. I'm never going to learn it all. Whereas to me, it's this exhilarating, I'm never going to stop learning that. I'm always going to be learning. I'm always going to find something new. Every time I go outside, there's going to be something new that amazes me, or I get to see, or I get to witness, or I get to get confused by and try to figure it out. I'm always going to be learning about the landscape. And that to me is the biggest reward out of it all. It assists me with my trapping. It assists me with my hunting, with my foraging, with my gardening. It assists me with getting medicines for my home. It assists me with dealing with camping trips, hunting trips, expeditions, all these things. And all these things are important. It's a huge aspect of my risk assessments, everything with weather, trees, animal activity, all that kind of stuff. But the fact that I'm never going to stop learning, that is the most exciting news I've got. So that's all I have to rant about. And I've been ranting a lot longer than Chris has. I ranted for an hour when he only ranted for 40 minutes. So we're well over time. With that being said, I want to thank Chris for having me here. I'm going to pass it back to Chris to talk about a little bit more.
No, we're going to wrap it up real quick here, but
okay.
You didn't disappoint at all there, Caleb. Thanks so much for everything you shared there. Just a couple words before we break here tonight, folks. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. I know there was so much information in there, that Caleb just shared, but I love that talk. Like, I made a ton of notes every time. I learned a few new ones from him, man. So thanks so much for sharing so openly with us here tonight. Just a quick shout out, if anyone is, feeling really inspired to go deeper with this, that was a lot of information in front of the computer. If you want to get together in person, I know Caleb has a bunch of classes coming up this winter. You can go over to his website, canadianbushcraft.ca, or go to his his Facebook page for Canadian Bushcraft. And he's got a bunch of cool classes coming up. I might pass it back to him just a minute for that. I did want to mention, so I've got an online course that I've been running for years called Reading Nature's Language. It's one of my favorite courses that I've actually run over the years, and I think we're going to be running it for the last time this winter. I would love to go out with a real bang with this one. We have an amazing community. We basically meet every other week, and we dive deep into the topics that we're talking about right now. And it's not just a lecture; like, these are interactive calls, and with activities that you go out and do on the land. So if you're interested in really going on a deep dive into, learning to read about the weather, understanding what are the birds actually saying, looking at those track patterns and being able to read that story, I invite you to consider joining us. It's basically a few months commitment. So we're going to meet every other week for about the length of this call, about an hour and a half. We're going to dive deep. I've got a whole bunch of videos that are pre-recorded and workbooks for you to go out on the land. And it's on sale for $100 off right now. And with this being the last time I'm doing it, I just want to put people in it and have a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to put out a code right now. If you put in AWARE24, you'll get another $50 off. So it's the cheapest I've ever actually sold this course for. So AWARE24 is the code. And if you go to the events page on my website, I'll throw the link in there in a minute. Consider joining us in Reading Nature's Language for our last cohort here. I may not actually run this course again, and I'm quite excited about it. Also, if you're up in Muskoka area or Southern Ontario and you want to come hang out on the land, I got a couple programs. My tracking course is coming up, a day out on the land on the edge of Algonquin Park. And I also have a program called Ways of the Wild, where we meet one weekend a month, February, March, April, May, and we're diving deep into skills on the land. We're going to be doing some trapping. We're going to be doing some ice fishing. We're going to be doing lots of fire skills, winter medicine making, wildlife tracking, bird language, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in really diving deep, I would love to hang out with you in Muskoka or hang out with you online for the Nature's Language course. Other than that, thanks so much for sticking with us. That was a long one. Caleb, you want to just share anything else about your courses?
Yeah, so
I'm going to throw the link in for my courses in the chat there if anyone wants to check it out.
Brilliant. So we have an AXE safety certification course happening this Saturday at 9 a.m. in Hiawatha First Nation. This is one of a kind workshop that only happens with us. We are the only certifying board for the AXE safety certification course in all of Canada. The only other place that you get that kind of knowledge is working as an employee for the U.S. Forest Service in the United States. So the only other way you can learn this kind of stuff is going down and working for them. Other than that, maybe working with wildland firefighters, but even then they use mostly chainsaws and other tools. Hand tools, not as much. The AXE safety certification is coming up this Saturday. You get to go home. We email you we mail you, sorry, not email, a certificate once you pass the course. And this is great if you're a guide. This is great if you are an outdoors instructor. This is great if you work at a forest school or an outdoor education center, anything like that. If you're a hunting, fishing guide, anything like that, where you may have to use an axe, and you're like many places now are not allowing people to use axes on their jobs because they're dangerous, but they're going to allow you to use chainsaws and all kinds of power tools because they can certify you. We certify you in the axe safety world, in axe craft in general. You learn how to choose the right axe for the right job, learn how to maintain that tool, and then how to use it safely in multiple skills, including falling of the tree. So that's coming up this coming weekend. We have an entire list of courses dropping this week for the remainder of 2024 and 2025. We are moving our winter 1 week survival course to February just because of conditions and weather and timing. So we're moving that to early February in the next couple of days, announcing when those dates are changing to, and then everything else is going to be laid out by the end of this week. So you can all check out all of our workshops. They're going to be laid out on Facebook for now on events, and then we're going to be having hopefully by the end of this month a Thrive Card account on CanadianBushcraft.ca where you can register for the courses online, get everything you need right there. Don't have to deal with me not responding to emails or forgetting to check my messages like I do every day because my brain is going in 25 different directions because I wear 25 different hats. So check us out on CanadianBushcraft.ca for the website, but also check out our Facebook. You can also check out our Instagram. We have two. The one that's currently active is Canadian.bushcraft.2. Check that out. You can message us on there. Messages are working now. I checked that today. We had a couple of issues with message requests, putting everything basically into a junk mail folder, but we fixed that today. So you can go on there and contact us for more information. But Facebook is probably the easiest way right now to check out what courses we've got available. If you don't see the courses up yet, they'll be up by Friday. So 2 more days. I promise they'll be up in 2 days at the most, if not by the end of the night. That's all I got to say right now. Chris, again, thank you so much for having me here. Hopefully everybody enjoyed their time. I don't want to drag this on any longer. So thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you to say good night. Good night, folks. Much love. Stay warm.
Night, everybody. Caleb, can you just stick around for just a second?
But of course.
Good night. Thanks, y'all.
Later.
Gina Quatch turned on my mic.
Ewaman, everybody.
Stop our recording. I'll end the live.